This morning we have a huge opportunity, and during the day, to perhaps ask ourselves questions, look at the issues that are current at the moment in terms of built heritage. But I suppose in essence, we're all dealing in the same business of respecting the past. How do we enhance the present? And is it possible to shape the future in a strategic way? And I suppose I'm opening the presentation by asking those sort of questions, and I'll end on a question. But first, in terms of looking at a forward approach to built heritage and architectural policy, we first have to look at the sort of context that we and most of these people in this room as practitioners would understand. I think the first issue is obviously in terms of the environmental and sustainability challenges that we face. Our experts tell us that by the end of the century, if we continue to use resources at the current rate we're using them, we'll need 3 of these. Now obviously that's both unsustainable, but it's obviously impossible. So obviously this whole challenge of looking at resources existing and current is posing new problems but new opportunities for us. I suppose the second key issue is, and Fergal outlined this in his keynote, is that as a world, in terms of the world population, the London School of Economics did a report, I think 5 years ago now, looking at projected demographics across the world, and it suggested that, or we know that today 50% of the world's population live in urban areas, and by 2050 that'll be 75%. Potentially that is going to increase. So our demands and challenges on our current infrastructure is going to be more pressed. So we have to look at what it is we have. And then obviously issues of climate change, the challenges that we face in terms of global warming, energy efficiency. This has a direct impact on our built heritage, but it also has a challenge in the way we work together, how we do things, how we consume, how we look at these resources. So there are bigger issues facing us all collectively in every sector: heritage, housing, planning, water, environment. These are all issues that are collectively an issue for us all. In terms of our ambitions as a department, as a society, as practitioners here today, taking ourselves, first of all, we obviously have a mandate, a mission. The Minister of the Department is to provide a policy and legislative framework to protect our heritage, but also to promote an increased public awareness and appreciation of our architecture and our built heritage, but also to conserve, manage and forward plan for sustainable use of this heritage, so that as we are current stewards of our heritage, that in the future our descendants will enjoy that same quality of built environment that we are enjoying collectively today. I use the analogy, maybe it's a rather unfortunate analogy, but that of an iceberg. 30% of an iceberg's mass is only visible from above the surface, and we know that 70% of what an iceberg is below the surface, and that in a way, if you take heritage, on the surface it can be about regulatory protection, purely conservation, the historic built environment and the cultural value of place, and one can't disagree with that on the surface. But as most people probably here understand and are involved in heritage management, is that it's about a whole range of other issues. It's about functionality, it's about reuse, it's about presentation, it's definitely about education, but also about urban design, innovation, public engagement, work practices, awareness, environmental issues, placemaking. Not at the very bottom, but central to all this is a quality of life question. How do we make our places qualitative, competitive, but also that we have a strong cultural tradition for protecting these places? And that can be to do with cities and towns at the macro level. It can be to do with individual buildings. It can be about insertions, adaptations to our public realm, our city realm, that can be problematic or pose solutions. It can be about buildings, reusing buildings, and finding appropriate uses for redundant stock And we're dealing with this issue, and most bodies will tell you in terms of stock that is literally, we have to create and find new uses for. And I think principally at the centre of all this is that if you go back to the principle of our heritage, of our architectural heritage, it fundamentally was about shelter. That as a civilization, as human beings, we had to collate or collectively gather together under something or within something, within a shelter, whether it's a gallery, whether it's a civic use, residential use, if it's a school building. So a lot about this is about using the stock and heritage that we have and continuing to use it in that way. And if we can't continue to use it in one way, is to find different ways of using it. There's obviously the landmark projects. There are those that continue to be in the use intended, and we should support and enhance and promote those. There are also those structures, and we tend to spend a lot of time, and rightly so, talking about those that are in danger, those that need enabling, need a little bit of support, but also challenging communities and local authorities and ourselves to look at uses for, appropriate uses for existing buildings that may be in trouble. There is no silver bullet. It seems to be a combination of a number of things, and context is key. It's depending on where it is, what it is, as well as the historical importance of it. But we shouldn't take our eye off the qualitative ball, as it were, that while we are doing this, we're also building the heritage of tomorrow, effectively. We're also adding to our current public realm, qualitatively, unqualitatively, and these are the choices we make every day that impact on our existing environment, but all our future planned environment. And that's to do with also the places that we've inherited over the centuries and millennia, and the choices we make about putting things in that place or that landscape. So in terms of what it is we would like to contribute to this current challenge in terms of a vision, well, I think that's just a summary of a few areas that were already outlined this morning. We have concluded a review of the operation of Part 4 of the Planning and Development Act 2000 with the help and support of an expert advisory committee of the chairs here today. And we hope to bring these conclusions to the Minister and have a dialogue on this. But having looked at it, I mean, just to re-emphasise what the Assistant Secretary has said, the experience on the ground is that we have a very robust legislative vehicle or framework, that it has stood the test of time. There are areas that need to respond to the challenges that I mentioned earlier on, such as reuse. There are technical issues within it that probably are being applied inconsistently nationally. We have to look at those. And there are perhaps some enforcement issues we have to look at. So effectively, we welcome that level of engagement, and we hope to progress that going forward. The second one is an initiative which the Minister promoted himself, which is called the Historic Towns Initiative, which really started from a review of what was happening with the existing heritage towns designation, which was a good question because it seemed to flow between a number of bodies and agencies. But we took that opportunity to maybe turn this around and look at, in response to the urban challenges of places at the macro level, is to develop a framework for towns, primarily of a large historic content, that could look at a different approach, and I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail at the very end. But that is very much looking at heritage-led regeneration at the town, small town and village level, and see how that can contribute to the overall economy of places. We also have a reuse guidance manual that we're currently concluding, and I'll mention that in a minute. But also, out of the Part 4 review, I think we understand that there has to be some dialogue or narrative on funding the fiscal framework we work within. Are there different ways we can look at this? We've looked at this in other countries to see how it is we can support and develop our heritage within that framework. But also it's about coordinating what it is that we currently have in terms of resources, as Fergal outlined. For example, with the National Monument Service and the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, in having a tourism tool in terms of the great work and the publications that this survey does and entail. And on that we have a number of websites that are focused on heritage tourism. So how do we do a lot of this? Well, I suppose the first thing is, on a day-to-day basis, we have capital, albeit constrained, but it is enough to support at some level, those structures that are at immediate risk. And that's the sort of question in terms of, at some point, it's just having enough money to give us more options on things, is to stop the deterioration process, but also to sort of give us a little bit more time. There are also, there's also focus on this whole notion of energy efficiency and retrofitting program. I think that potentially inadvertently to the building at risk, there is a sector at risk, our own sector, in terms of perhaps an unskilled labour force applying a retrofit solution to traditional buildings that don't act in the same way as a modern contemporary residential unit. So I think that's a challenge we're all going to face. So we are addressing that. Completion of a national landscape strategy early next year, I think, is going to address some of the more wider issues in terms of our landscape and public realm, and that's part of the heritage family as well. So, but most notably, I think in the last 6 months, we coordinated a policy approach with environment on retail planning guidelines. And it was obvious to me and my colleagues in environment that the fundamental challenges of the retail sector in most towns in Ireland were A, probably being put in the wrong location in terms of peri-urban development, but they were missing the collective opportunity of reinventing. What we'll probably hear about later is avoiding the donut effect. That's reinvesting in our towns and cities. So in terms of having a forward plan strategy, I think this is going to have a huge knock-on effect in terms of an appropriate reuse of our historic town centres in terms of uses on the retail side. And that's applicable and uses the core urban design principles that are shared in most approaches in terms of housing and planning and public realm strategies. The other one, which is coming to a conclusion, that's just a kind of a shot of it, is the reuse manual. And again, that's been very, very interesting. And certainly it's tasked us to look at appropriate reuses through a series of case studies. So it's to lead by example, to look at those that are already being done within the current legislative framework and to actually showcase how this can be developed. And I think obviously then in terms of the advice series and the sort of core advisory guidance note, when we talk about reuse, we have other challenges in terms of fire, access. Dublin City are doing some good work, which we'll hear about later today, about reinventing the South Georgian cores. But there are challenges with that. There are challenges about temporary zoning. There are challenges about appropriate reuse at the macro level and to incentivise that reuse. So there, I think, as the Chair mentioned this morning, there are technical issues, there are legislative issues, there are financial issues, but they have to be collectively coordinated. So just to finally end, I'm just going to mention just a slight breakdown of the Historic Towns Initiative, because it was interesting when we started to look at how other countries in Europe were dealing with macro heritage issues. We decided, or we discovered, that there were 4 or 5 core objectives that repeated continually. I'm working with colleagues in Historic Scotland and English Heritage and in some European countries. Obviously, we have to have, at a central and local level, a spatial plan. There has to be a strategic plan, whether it's a public realm plan, an urban design framework plan, or statutory city county development plans, LAPs. You have to have a focus as to what's important in an area, what are the objectives for enhancing that area at a macro level. That's bringing in all streams, not just the heritage stream, that's all streams within the development process. Obviously, the right balance of fiscal incentives, and various countries have different solutions in how you do that. Some, like the UK, focus on qualifying tax relief on works to protect structures, others use VAT, others use area-based incentives. Fergal's correct, we've come out of that period where we're slightly numb when we hear the word incentive, area-based incentives. But maybe there's a way to look at this that is incisive and specific without the bubble effects. But it's about creating the right environment for growth. That's the key issue here. Urban governance, there has to be a key, strong, central and local approach, basically a quality assurance approach, that we have qualitative objectives with qualitative outcomes, and that we coordinate that in terms of an appropriate control mechanism. It's also about leveraging finance and funding. Again, we've had to basically, given the predicament that we found ourselves in, to actually work creatively across government in terms of the LEADER programme. That's an envelope of 165 million by the end of 13. I think 1/3 of that is designated for heritage purposes. We're working with Watch Ireland on strategic projects to deal with the macro heritage issues at an urban level. And then obviously the Heritage Council has been for some time now dealing with the Department for Agriculture on the Reps 4 scheme, which has had some success in actually enabling people at a local rural level in terms of the stock that they have and giving the right advice centrally and locally in terms of how you approach these things. But it's also about, in terms of heritage-led regeneration, about leading by example, using that construction sector, which the repair and maintenance industry is a huge sector in Ireland. It's incrementally happening as we speak, at a small, middle and large level. And I think it's actually being able to tap into that through the energy efficiency programme, but also to look at using skilled labour as labour that we are using, and we have to reinvest in that. Interestingly, 92% of construction activity in Europe is to do with the reuse of existing stock, both historic and non-historic. So that goes to show you that level of expertise across Europe dealing with the reuse sector. But none of this works if we don't go back and look at it in retrospect. It has been an evidence-based approach. And I think the heritage sector and our partner organisations and bodies are very good at this. We have to be critical, we have to look back so that we can look forward to understand what it is we're doing is correct. And I think just to end on a question, and some people will be familiar with this quote, it's a quote from one of the earliest guidance manuals, Vitruvius's Treaty de Architectura, which is over 2 millennia old, but he summarised the qualitative argument in terms of commodity, firmness and delight. And really we're asking ourselves the same questions today. Is what we do and make and deliver, is it marketable? Is it a commodity people want to use and reuse? Is it fit for purpose? Is it functional? Architects over the millennia have to design buildings and deliver buildings with function and an intended use. And obviously, is it qualitative? Is it delightful? Is it aesthetically pleasing to look at? I think we should always ask ourselves these questions and trying to reach the wider objectives. Thank you.